I'm talking with Tom Vernon at the Museum of Magnetic Sound Recording, and he's going to share his whole life about magnetic recording. Thank you, Tom.
Well, I guess my earliest work with electronics, not as much with recording, was in the 70s. I grew up in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, which was the quartz crystal manufacturing headquarters of the United States. There were 5 quartz crystal companies there, and one of them had an explorer post. And I used to go every Thursday night, and that was my real introduction to electronics. And later on I started hanging around the local radio stations, and I guess that's when I started with the audio end. And one of them had a tape caster cart machine someone had taken apart. They were ready to throw it out. They said, "You want to have a whack at this?" So I brought it home and took the transport apart. The next day I brought it back together, and they said, "You want a job?" And things just kind of took off from there. My dad taught at the college there at Dickinson, and so I knew the guy who was the technician in the physics department. And back then, of course, government surplus stuff was flowing like water.
Right.
And so this guy would, and I would stop by on my way home from school every now and then, and this guy would, they would get stuff, and he would save stuff from me. So I'd go into the Explorer post and like, well, here's this HP 400 audio VTVM, it's not working, and I'd bring it in. And they'd say, "Oh, well, let's go down to the archives. We'll see if we've got the manual." And they had 3 shifts going on then, and they had people all over the place. I mean, in test. So he'd say, "So let's walk down." So we'd walk through the factory and go in this room, and there was just like a wall of file cabinets, and the advisor would say, "This is Tom Vernon. He's one of our explorers. He's just got an HP 400E. Have we got a manual for that?" And the guy just get up and go through, and say, "Yeah." And he said, "Well, can you do me a favor and make a copy?" And I said, "Okay, yeah, it'll be done in 15 minutes." And then we'd go down to the shop and they'd say, "Well, let's see what it's doing." And it's like, "Well, let's check all the tubes." And they have had, of course, the mother of all Hickok tube testers.
Yeah.
And 2 or 3 of them would be bad, and there would be somebody in the stockroom and said, "Could you get me a 12SJ7, a 5Y3, and a 6AL5?" And they'd say, "Sure." So all of a sudden you've got all the new tubes, and our meetings were like 2 or 3 hours, and by the time the night was over, you had the manual for the thing. All the tubes had been checked, and the advisor would say, "Well, during the week, if you get a chance, just go through it and log all the socket voltages, and bring it back next week, and we'll start on it." And that's how I got my test equipment. But it's like for a kid to have access to that kind of facilities and the expertise of this whole crystal plant, and then they would just basically do anything for you. So yeah. So that was the
what an opportunity.
So that's kind of like how I got knowledgeable about test equipment at an early age, was just and whenever anything new came out, they got it at Reeves Hoffman, and sometimes they take us down and say, this is a brand new Tektronix storage oscilloscope, and it can store slow waveforms, and you can come back and look at them. And it was all, this was before digital, it was all the phosphors on the screen, and we'd be like, wow. But just like, how many 15-year-old kids get to see this?
Into the Explorer group, was it in electronics?
It was, and it was somebody else I knew, another kid at high school, who was also into electronics, and said, "Hey, there's a bunch of us, and we meet at Reeves Hoffman every Thursday, and it doesn't cost anything to join." And I'm like, "Really?" And then I went one time, of course, and I was hooked. And then it was like, and I kept getting stuff from the physics department that they were throwing away and bringing it in. So I had all this 15-year-old kid with HP test equipment that had all been restored and tweaked to perfection, and I knew how to calibrate it, and just things just took off from there. Yeah.
That's great. Thank you.
Yeah. My first job, I guess, in radio and broadcasting was in 1969 when I was in high school, and I worked at the local cable company, and they had a local dance party called TV 12 Turns On, and I was one of the cameramen, and that was the first job. And back then minimum wage was $1.60 an hour, and that's what I got.
That's good, though. I mean, what a place to start.
Yeah.
So you started in camera more than audio.
That was my only job in television for years, and then I think in the 80s I worked for one summer as a replacement at Channel 7 in Boston, and I worked on audio for part of the time during the Look Show, and I worked in the VTR room with the old RCA video cart machines. Yeah, that was my job, to come in there and you'd look at all the commercials, you'd pull them and load them into the slots on the video cart machine, and away they went. And it was a pneumatic wonder.
Yeah.
The whole machine was driven off, air pressure and vacuums, and it just very cool.
What was the first recorder you ever saw or dealt with?
Probably the Ampex 350s, because that would have been around 68, 69 when I was in high school. And so pretty much everything from then to now I've been involved with as far as working on. And
Wow.
a lot of my career was around my education. I did my master's at Boston University and worked at WBUR while I was there. And 10 years later went back for my doctorate at University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia and worked at WXPN and also worked on the World Cafe. And one of my big jobs was maintenance of all the tape recorders there. And we had everything from Ampex 350s all the way through the Sony APR 5000 we were just looking at. So my job was to maintain all of those.
So you basically started at the top.
Well, I don't know, but
It seems like with
Yeah.
grief with that.
but along the way I got involved with writing. About 83 I started writing for Radio World. I just wrote one article and they kind of liked it and said, you want to be a regular columnist? So I've been doing that ever since, pretty much on a monthly basis, and done everything from product reviews to interviews to obituaries to nickel tours of radio stations to the whole bit, to feature articles about emerging technologies. And
Fun.
and I guess sort of that brings us up to more recent years where I've been writing for newsletters and writing tech manuals, and most of my work now is for the Telos Corporation, where I write a lot of their manuals. I write their newsletter. I come around to places like this and talk to people like you and get ideas and articles for the newsletter. One of the neat things about Telos is writing tech manuals is they allow me to write haiku poems about the technology and the equipment and stick them in the manuals. So,
Oh, how cool.
and they actually encourage me to do that.
That's funny. That's funny.
Yeah.
But you have your own collection at Real.
Yes, I do.
Other
Oh, yes. My house has been described as a combination art gallery and vintage technology museum, and
Good.
I have. Over the years, I'm also a pack rat along with everything else. So every place I worked, if stuff was being thrown out and never made it to the dumpster, it ended up at my house.
All right.
So 40 years later, I'm beginning to put it on display. Part of what I do for Telos is a regular monthly feature called Found in the Attic, where I go up in the attic and pull down a piece of equipment, write about the history of the technology, describe the piece of equipment and kind of where I got it, and photograph it, and it appears in the newsletter. And as I'm doing that, I'm kind of looking at these things and saying, I really don't want to put them back in the attic. I should put them on display. So gradually, some of the books in the bookshelves are being sacrificed to put the equipment on display. So I'm in the process of putting tags on it. But I've got everything from, I think the oldest thing I have is an Atwater Kent Model 40 from 1924. A few other things from that era, all the way through, the traditional cathedral radios and console radios. So there's a lot of that. See, in the study, I have a 1947 General Electric frequency and modulation monitor. It was part of the original equipment of WBZ FM in Boston. What else do we have? We have yours. We have Otaris as far as reel-to-reel equipment. I'm just trying to think what else is down in the attic in the basement.
Can people get in to see it?
No, it's not really at that point, but I've often told people that once I get everything tagged and identified, then I start charging admissions. That's
Right,
that's the joke.
that.
So yeah.
I kept going around because of age, not remembering what everyone was, and one of my board members said, you ought to try just making little plastic stand-up things about each one. And I went, ding,
Yeah.
it works.
Yeah.
Now I don't have to remember.
Yeah. Yeah, that's my next project. So
All right.
yeah.
What is your favorite machine? You talk about working with a lot of different machines, but you talked especially about the BR20 at Tascam.
Yes. The BR20 is interesting. Is my work at WXPN was taking care of a lot of the reel-to-reel machines, everything, as I said, from the 350 to the APR 5000, and they were all good machines. But the thing I noticed, and I was there for almost 7 years, is the BR20 just never went out of adjustment. We brought everything down to the shop once every 3 months for a complete overhaul, because these were the things we were using for the live recordings for World Cafe, so they were fairly critical. And everything else, needed tweaks, and they'd be a little bit out of adjustment, alignment, heads, height, azimuth, the whole bit. set the BR20 up on the bench, and it was always just the same. And after 3 months, you maybe had to tweak the high end a little bit because the heads were wearing a little bit, but the azimuth was perfect, record level was right on, record EQ, and it would be on the bench and tested and back in about an hour, because there really was nothing to do with it. And of all the machines we had, it was just the most stable, and of course, as you know, probably the least expensive.
Right.
And how Tascam is able to do that is a mystery, but Tascam is just legendary for coming in at a lower price point and making great equipment. So there you go.
Yeah. We use that for any of our master transfers. And the Atari, we really have found that the Atari just doesn't hiccup really hardly.
Yeah.
And it'll run test tones for us. You said you'd worked with some early Ampexes, and you'd also worked with some of the Inovonics amplifiers.
Right.
Tell us a little bit about how that evolved, if you don't mind.
The history of Inovonics and the marketing, you mean?
Yeah,
or
how they arrived at. Is that a fair story?
Yeah, it is. It's a great story. If you go back in the day to the early 1970s, the 350s were kind of the older machine, and the 440s had come along. The 350s, of course, had the vacuum tube electronics. The 440s were solid state, and there were a lot of smaller market radio stations who, wanted to kind of upgrade, but of course Ampex wanted to sell you a whole new machine, and a lot of those stations couldn't afford the 440, and they were just kind of suffering, and people kind of made up their own electronics with op amps, but not the record, and it was kind of hit or miss, and it kind of worked. And after a while, of course, the 440 electronics kind of fell behind too, and Ampex never did anything about the electronics. The transports would live forever, but your specs were kind of hurting because the electronics were what they were. So along comes this guy named Jim Wood out in California, and he comes out with the first solid state replacement electronics. They're rack mount on the back. The cables everything is pin for pin, cable for cable, compatible with the Ampex machines. And the neat thing is, in the front cover, you pull out the cards for the playback and record electronics. There's little dip switches, and in the manual you can set it up for the high impedance heads with the 350, the low impedance ones with the 440, and there were a few other options. And once you got those dip switches set, and then you had 10 turn pots for all the tweaks, and they were very stable. So all of a sudden you could have an old 350 and have better than state-of-the-art sound with the Inovonics electronics. So
stability and everything.
And and that was really what launched the company. And of course Inovonics went on to bigger and better things and different products, and of course after a while that whole product line went away because real machines went away. But that was the origin of the solid state electronics at Inovonics. And when I was working in Boston at WBUR, we didn't have a lot of money. We had Ampex 350s and 440s everywhere, but not enough money to buy replacements for all of them. So people wound up kind of shuttling the machines up and around the station that had the Inovonics electronics, because everybody wanted to use those.
Right.
And when I worked there as an engineer, we had standing orders that things like NPR Concert Hall on Saturday afternoons had to be played back on the machines with Inovonics electronics because the sound quality was so much better.
Is the tone, the test tone, the tones that you were talking about, would that be of interest to people that you were just mentioning?
It might be, yeah. This was a very time-consuming process to at XPN and anywhere as the guy who tunes up the electronics, because typically, you'd bring the playback electronics in line, and then you do the record. But usually you had to make several passes through with a standard test tape, get the playback perfectly flat the way you wanted it. Then when you did the record electronics, you had to play with a bias to tune the high end to get it to match, and that was always a matter of recording it, playing with the bias, rewinding, playing it back, and then doing the response and saying, oh, it's a little bit off, one more pass. And you kept at it, and you'd get it right, but it was very time consuming. You really had to know your stuff. Well, I think it was in the mid-90s as I was doing product reviews for Radio World. Somehow I connected with Tektronix, and they said, we have multi-tone testing stuff we're going to start marketing in the US. Would you be interested in doing a review? And I said, definitely. So they sent this out to me at XPN, and first thing I did after I read the manuals was make a reel-to-reel cassette and broadcast cart multi-tone alignment. And once I did that, everything changed. I mean, the whole maintenance time was reduced, I don't know, probably by 3/4, because basically once you had, once you would do the sweep with the playback and you could tune everything up in one pass, because you're basically looking at the display, you're looking at the frequency response in real time, so there's no rewind or delay. And then you record the multi-tone track after you've aligned the playback, and that's where it's fun, because as you tune the bias, you're actually seeing the high-end response change in real time, or near real time, just the distance from the record head to the playback. And having done that, it was, I said, it was probably 3/4 reduction in maintenance time, and for a much more accurate frequency response. And what happened with that was in, again, around 95, 96, and everybody knew by then that digital was well on the way, and analog was on its way out. And while it was a great idea, it was just probably two things. It was kind of late in the game, and it was pretty expensive since it was Tektronix. So as far as I know, I don't know that it was ever really marketed or brought, it was kind of a product they were playing around with, they were trying it out, and I don't think it ever went anywhere.
How cool to get a chance to...
It is, and if that technology had come out maybe 10 years earlier and it was at a good price point, it would have just been phenomenal.
When did you first start seeing the reel-to-reels disappear?
Well, that was, they were starting to just disappear when I was at XPN. We were doing all of the recording of World Cafe on reel-to-reel, and I think, I would guess maybe by 95 we were rolling DAT backup, digital tape, and gradually it kind of switched around, and the DAT was the master. We had 2 DAT machines, and then the reel-to-reel was the backup. But we were still doing the first recording on reel-to-reel, because at that time you couldn't edit on DAT tapes.
Right.
But everything was kind of, after it was done, everything was being mastered onto the DAT, and that's what was being played back rather than reel-to-reel. So. Really, what happened is everything went to hard drive editing, of course, and that was just beginning to take over around 1998, I would guess. Yeah. But there was that whole period in there where, where it was transitioning out. So.
Are you restoring most of the stuff?
I do all my own restorations. Wow. Yes.
Cool.
Yeah. Later on, after WBUR, I worked at KISS 108 in Boston back when that was the disco station, and Heftel owned it, and we were doing a lot of innovative things with technology. I've always been interested in the new technology, and partially through the writing I've been able to get demo equipment, as it prototypes, and work with it.
Wonderful place to be.
Yeah.
Tom, thank you very much. I really appreciate you taking the time to go through the museum and talking to us.
My pleasure.